One of the biggest misunderstandings people have about avoidance is that their silence means emotional freedom. It doesn't. Silence is not peace for an avoidant. It is protection. It is a psychological shelter they learned to build long before they met you. Most avoidants are not running from love itself. They are running from the vulnerability, dependency, and emotional exposure that love inevitably activates inside them. And the moment intimacy becomes too real, too emotionally demanding, or too uncertain, they retreat into the one place where they feel powerful again: distance. That distance can look cold on the outside. It can feel indifferent. Sometimes it even feels cruel. But psychologically, what is happening beneath the surface is much more complex. Avoidants associate emotional closeness with the loss of autonomy. Deep connection unconsciously triggers fear because somewhere in their nervous system, intimacy became connected with pressure, disappointment, criticism, or emotional overwhelm. So when emotions intensify, their instinct is not to lean closer. It is to create space. Now here is where most people make the mistake that destroys their leverage. The moment the avoidant pulls away, they panic. They chase harder. They send longer messages. They try to explain their value, explain the relationship, explain the future. But the more emotional pursuit an avoidant feels, the more trapped they become internally. What you think is love, they experience as pressure. And pressure strengthens their need to escape. But something radically different happens when you stop chasing, when you become calm, when you stop trying to force connection, when you stop monitoring every text, every delay, every emotional shift. You remove the emotional noise that allowed them to stay psychologically defended, because now the silence changes meaning completely. Before, the silence was comforting to them because they knew you were still emotionally waiting in the background. They knew the connection remained available. Even in distance, there was reassurance. Your pursuit became emotional insurance. But once your energy genuinely withdraws, once your attention is no longer chasing them, the silence stops feeling safe. It becomes confrontational because now they are no longer escaping you. They are sitting with themselves. And that is the moment avoidants often begin feeling emotions they successfully suppressed while the relationship was active. Human beings can distract themselves from emotions through movement, conflict, or control. But absence removes distraction. Your absence forces reflection. Suddenly, the avoidant starts noticing the emotional space you occupied in their life, not intellectually, but emotionally. This is why so many avoidants circle back after periods of silence. Not because silence magically manipulates them, but because emotional reality catches up to them when external stimulation disappears. The nervous system eventually slows down, the distractions lose their power. And what remains is the emotional imprint of the connection they tried to minimize. They remember your presence in ordinary moments. They compare new interactions to the emotional safety they once felt with you. They begin questioning whether their withdrawal protected them or isolated them. And here is the deeper truth most people never understand. Avoidants are often more affected by emotional loss and absence than in the relationship itself. Why? Because during the relationship, avoidance protects them from fully feeling. But in solitude, the defenses weaken. The emotions they postpone begin resurfacing. Regret surfaces. Curiosity surfaces. Longing surfaces. And the most powerful part is this: none of this happens because you convinced them verbally. It happens because your absence created psychological clarity. People do not fully understand value when constant access removes the fear of loss. But when someone who brought emotional depth, consistency, and genuine connection is no longer emotionally available, the human mind pays attention. Even the avoidant mind. That is why emotional self-control is so powerful. Not because it is a strategy to manipulate someone, but because it restores your dignity and forces reality to reveal itself naturally. The less you try to force someone to see your worth, the more undeniable it becomes in your absence. And sometimes the silence that was meant to protect them becomes the very thing that awakens them. What truly unsettles an avoidant is not emotional intensity, it is emotional stability. Most people think passion, constant reassurance, or dramatic displays of affection are what create attraction and emotional impact. But with avoidant personalities, the opposite is often true. The more emotionally reactive you become, the more predictable you become. And the more predictable you become, the easier it is for them to retreat into emotional distance without ever confronting themselves. You have to understand something fundamental about avoidance. Many of them learned early in life to associate emotional dependence with danger. Somewhere in their experience, closeness stopped feeling safe. So when someone becomes highly emotional around them, constantly seeking reassurance, constantly reacting to every shift in energy, it unconsciously confirms their deepest fear, that intimacy leads to pressure, obligation, and loss of freedom. This is why emotional self-control becomes so psychologically powerful. And let's be clear, emotional self-control is not emotional suppression. It is not pretending not to care. It is not playing games. Real self-control means you feel deeply, but you are no longer controlled by what you feel. There is a difference. One comes from fear. The other comes from strength. When you stop reacting impulsively to their distance, something changes inside the dynamic. For the first time, the avoidant no longer feels emotionally cornered. Instead, they begin observing you differently. Your calmness creates uncertainty in their usual psychological patterns. They expect pursuit. They expect emotional escalation. They expect guilt, pressure, or desperation. But when none of that appears, their nervous system loses the familiar script it relies on. And that disruption creates a tension. Human psychology is deeply influenced by contrast. When someone behaves differently from what we expect, the mind becomes alert. Suddenly, they begin asking questions internally. Why are you so calm? Why are you no longer chasing validation? Why does your energy feel grounded instead of anxious? That curiosity becomes psychologically magnetic because calm confidence is rare in emotionally charged relationships. Most people think attraction comes from convincing someone of their value, but mature attraction often comes from witnessing someone who already recognizes their own value without needing constant confirmation from others. That energy changes everything, because emotional regulation communicates something deeper than words ever can. It communicates security. It communicates self-respect. It communicates that your identity is not collapsing simply because someone became distant. And for avoidants, this is deeply disorienting because many are accustomed to relationships where emotional chaos reinforces their belief that closeness is unsafe. But your stability challenges that belief. You become evidence that intimacy does not have to mean emotional suffocation. You become evidence that connection can exist without control, panic, or dependency. And that realization quietly begins reshaping the way they perceive you. Now here's the paradox most people fail to understand. The less you emotionally force yourself into the avoidance mind, the more space they have to think about you voluntarily. Pressure creates resistance, but emotional composure creates psychological openness. And this is not only true in relationships, it is true in life. People trust strength that remains calm under uncertainty. Anyone can feel centered when everything is going well. But emotional maturity reveals itself in moments of ambiguity, rejection, and silence. When you continue growing, continue focusing on your purpose, continue protecting your peace, instead of obsessing over their behavior, you stop operating from emotional scarcity. And scarcity energy pushes people away because it communicates fear of loss. But grounded energy communicates abundance. It says, I value connection, but I will not abandon myself to maintain it. That is the energy avoidants struggle to forget. Because deep down, avoidants are not only searching for love, they are searching for safety. And safety is not created through emotional intensity alone. It is created through consistency, calmness, and emotional discipline. The moment your peace becomes stronger than your need to chase, you stop losing yourself in the relationship. And that is often the moment the avoidant finally starts paying attention. One of the deepest psychological truths about human nature is this: people rarely understand the value of something while they believe it will always be available. Familiarity creates emotional blindness. And this becomes especially important when dealing with avoidant personalities, because avoidants are masters at suppressing emotional awareness while the connection is still within reach. When you are constantly present, constantly reassuring, constantly available no matter how distant they become, the avoidant nervous system adapts to your presence as certainty. And certainty lowers emotional urgency. It allows them to postpone reflection, postpone vulnerability, postpone accountability. Somewhere in their mind, there is an unconscious assumption that the connection can always be revisited later, when they feel more ready, less overwhelmed, less emotionally pressured. But psychology changes the moment access becomes uncertain. Scarcity has an extraordinary effect on human perception. The human mind instinctively assigns greater emotional significance to what feels limited, distant, or potentially lost. Not because people are manipulative, but because uncertainty forces attention. What was once emotionally background noise suddenly becomes psychologically important. And this is exactly what happens when you stop overextending your energy toward an avoidant. The moment your attention is no longer constantly available, their emotional system loses something it quietly relied on. Even if they acted detached, even if they appeared unaffected, your consistency created emotional stability in their world. Your messages, your patience, your emotional availability, all of it became part of the psychological environment they unconsciously depended on. But once that environment changes, the mind starts recalculating value. Suddenly they notice your absence in places they never noticed your presence. They notice the silence during moments they once took for granted. They notice the emotional space you occupied without realizing how much comfort it provided. And this is why avoidants often experience delayed emotional processing. They do not always feel the depth of attachment in real time. Many only begin fully experiencing it after distance removes immediate access. This confuses people because they assume love should create immediate emotional clarity. But avoidants often operate differently. Their defense mechanisms disconnect them from emotional intensity while the relationship is active. Emotional closeness triggers anxiety, so their nervous system protects itself through detachment, distraction, or emotional minimization. But absence removes the immediate threat of intimacy. And without that pressure, suppressed emotions begin surfacing naturally. This is why an avoidant may seem calm during the breakup but deeply affected months later. The emotional realization often arrives after the relationship is no longer fully accessible. Once the nervous system relaxes, the emotions they pushed away begin rising to the surface with surprising intensity. And here is where your behavior matters profoundly. If you continue chasing, begging, or making yourself endlessly available, you interrupt this process. You remove the scarcity that creates emotional reflection. The avoidant never fully experiences the psychological weight of losing access to you because your energy keeps cushioning the loss. But when you genuinely detach, not out of anger, not as manipulation, but from self-respect, reality becomes unavoidable. Now they must sit with uncertainty. And uncertainty is psychologically powerful because the brain seeks resolution. They begin wondering whether you are healing, whether you are moving forward emotionally, whether someone else is now receiving the emotional connection they once had access to. Your absence becomes mentally louder than your presence ever was. This is not about creating jealousy. It is about allowing consequences to become emotionally visible. For the first time, they are forced to experience life without the emotional security your presence quietly provided. And many avoidants only understand the depth of connection after that security disappears. Because people can intellectually dismiss value while they still possess it. But emotional truth becomes much harder to ignore once something meaningful feels permanently out of reach. And this is why your willingness to let go becomes transformative. Not only for them, but for you. Because the moment you stop trying to force recognition, you reclaim your power. You stop negotiating for emotional reciprocity. You stop trying to convince someone to see your worth. And ironically, that is often the moment your value becomes impossible to overlook. Sometimes distance succeeds where explanation fails, because absence has a way of revealing what presence allowed people to ignore. One of the most powerful shifts that happens when you emotionally detach from an avoidant is that you interrupt the internal narrative they unconsciously built about you. And most people never realize how much of human behavior is driven by narrative rather than reality. People move through relationships carrying assumptions, emotional predictions, and psychological scripts that allow them to feel in control. Avoidants are no different. Many avoidants unconsciously expect consistency from others even while they themselves remain emotionally inconsistent. They expect people to wait, to understand, to remain emotionally available despite distance, mixed signals, or silence. Not necessarily because they are malicious, but because they become accustomed to relationships where their withdrawal does not truly cost them connection. Somewhere in their mind, they begin believing access to you is permanent. And permanence creates psychological comfort. As long as they believe you will always remain emotionally attached, there is very little urgency for self-examination. They can continue avoiding difficult emotions because the relationship still feels psychologically accessible. Even if communication decreases, even if intimacy weakens, your continued emotional availability quietly reinforces the belief that nothing has fundamentally changed. But the moment you genuinely detach, the narrative collapses. Not performative detachment. Not cold games designed to provoke reactions. Real detachment, the kind that happens when you stop organizing your emotional life around their inconsistency. The kind that happens when your energy becomes focused on growth instead of monitoring their behavior. That shift is psychologically disruptive because it introduces unpredictability. And the human mind pays close attention to unpredictability. Suddenly, the avoidant can no longer confidently predict your emotional position. They no longer know if you are waiting, hoping, emotionally attached, or slowly moving on. And uncertainty activates attention in a way certainty never can. What once felt emotionally secure now feels unstable. This is where something fascinating begins happening internally for them. Your absence starts creating cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance occurs when reality no longer matches the story someone has been telling themselves. The avoidant may have convinced themselves that you would always remain emotionally available, always understanding, always present regardless of their behavior. But now reality is contradicting that assumption. You are calmer, less reactive, less emotionally dependent on their responses. You are no longer trying to force closeness. And because your behavior changed, they are forced to reevaluate their interpretation of the relationship itself. This is why detachments rooted in self-respect often create more impact than emotional confrontation ever could. Confrontation can be rationalized away. Avoidance can label it as pressure, drama, or emotional intensity. But peaceful detachment is harder to dismiss because it carries emotional finality without aggression. It communicates something profound without saying much at all. It says, I care deeply, but I will no longer abandon myself trying to hold on to someone unwilling to meet me halfway. That energy is powerful because it removes emotional control from the dynamic. Avoidants often feel safest when they control distance. They decide when intimacy increases and when it decreases. But your emotional independence changes the structure entirely. Now they are no longer managing the emotional pace alone. They are confronted with the possibility that your emotional world no longer revolves around them. And that realization can become incredibly destabilizing. Because beneath avoidance is often a hidden fear of abandonment they rarely admit, even to themselves. Many avoidants fear emotional engulfment, but they also fear being emotionally irrelevant. They want distance, but they do not want permanent disconnection. And when your detachment becomes real, those conflicting fears collide internally. That is when they begin paying attention in ways they previously resisted. Not because you manipulated them, but because your independence forced them to confront emotional truths they could previously avoid. Your growth becomes evidence that life continues without their participation. Your peace becomes evidence that you are no longer emotionally trapped inside their uncertainty. And the deeper lesson here goes beyond relationships entirely. The moment you stop trying to control how someone sees you, you become psychologically stronger because your identity is no longer dependent on external validation. You stop chasing clarity from people committed to confusion. You stop shrinking yourself to maintain fragile connection. And paradoxically, the less desperately you need someone's attention, the more impossible your absence becomes to ignore. Because nothing disrupts unhealthy patterns more powerfully than someone who finally learns how to walk away with peace instead of chaos. One of the most underestimated forces in human psychology is the impact of witnessing someone evolve without you. Nothing confronts an avoidant more deeply than seeing the person they emotionally distance themselves from becoming stronger, calmer, and more fulfilled in their absence. Because growth changes the emotional equation entirely. You have to understand, many avoidants unconsciously believe time is always on their side. They assume emotional doors remain open indefinitely. Even after distance, silence, or withdrawal, there is often a hidden belief that they can reconnect whenever they finally feel ready. And because they struggle with emotional urgency, they postpone difficult conversations, postpone vulnerability, postpone emotional accountability. But growth disrupts that illusion. The moment they sense that your healing is becoming real, something shifts internally. Not surface-level distractions, not temporary emotional reactions, real growth. The kind that changes your energy, your focus, your self-worth, and your emotional availability. Because growth signals permanence. And permanence is what activates fear inside avoidance more than emotional conflict ever could. When you remain emotionally stuck, constantly revolving around the relationship, the avoidant still feels psychologically connected to your emotional world. Even if they are distant, they can sense that your energy remains anchored to them. But once your life begins expanding beyond the relationship, they feel something profoundly unsettling, replacement of emotional centrality. In simple terms, they realize they may no longer be the emotional center of your life. That realization forces confrontation with a possibility they spent months avoiding, that they could actually lose you permanently. And human beings often react more strongly to potential permanent loss than to present emotional discomfort. During the relationship, the avoidant may have minimized the connection because closeness triggered anxiety. But when they see you evolving without them, anxiety changes form. Now the fear is no longer intimacy. The fear becomes irrelevance. This is why your growth becomes psychologically magnetic, not because you are trying to prove your worth. In fact, the moment growth becomes a performance designed to provoke jealousy, it loses its authenticity. Real transformation carries a different energy. It is quiet, grounded, stable. You are no longer trying to be seen. You are simply becoming someone who no longer abandons themselves for connection. And that energy changes how people perceive you. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional shifts, even when they pretend not to be. They notice when your attention is no longer fixated on them. They notice when your communication carries less emotional dependency. They notice when your identity becomes rooted in purpose, peace, and self-respect instead of emotional pursuit. And for many avoidants, this creates internal conflict. Because the version of you they emotionally categorized no longer exists. You are no longer the person waiting endlessly for clarity. No longer the person chasing reassurance. No longer the person emotionally pausing their life in hope of reciprocation. And that transformation forces them to confront a painful truth. While they were busy avoiding vulnerability, you were learning how to live without needing their validation. That realization can trigger deep regret. Not only because they fear losing you, but because growth often exposes what their avoidance cost them emotionally. They begin comparing your grounded energy to the emotional instability they encounter elsewhere. They begin recognizing the emotional safety, loyalty, and depth they once had access to, but failed to fully appreciate. And perhaps most importantly, your growth removes the emotional leverage avoidance once relied on. Avoidance often survives through imbalance, one person chasing while the other retreats. But when you stop chasing, the imbalance disappears. Now the avoidant is left face to face with someone who no longer needs emotional breadcrumbs to feel whole. That changes the power dynamic completely. And here is the deeper philosophical truth underneath all of this. People are forced to reevaluate your value when they realize your life does not stop in their absence. Strength is not becoming cold. Strength is continuing to evolve even after disappointment. It is refusing to let rejection define your identity. Because the ultimate form of emotional power is not making someone fear losing you. It is becoming someone who no longer fears losing themselves. Eventually, an avoidant reaches a moment where silence stops functioning the way it once did. In the beginning, silence feels powerful to them. It creates emotional distance. It gives them room to escape vulnerability, uncertainty, and the intensity of connection. Silence becomes a strategy for emotional self-protection. If they do not engage deeply, they do not have to fully confront what they feel. But human psychology does not allow emotional suppression to work forever. What people avoid consciously often continues growing unconsciously. Emotions that are postponed do not disappear. They accumulate beneath the surface. And over time, the silence that once felt relieving begins creating a different kind of discomfort. The distractions lose their effect. The emotional numbness weakens. And eventually, the avoidant is left alone with the very emotions they spent so much time trying not to feel. This is where many people misunderstand avoidance completely. They assume avoidants feel nothing because they express little. But emotional restraint is not emotional absence. In many cases, avoidants feel deeply. They simply struggle to process emotions safely in real time. Their nervous system associates vulnerability with emotional risk, so their instinct is to disconnect before emotions become overwhelming. But when the relationship is no longer active, when the emotional intensity settles, reflection begins. And reflection is dangerous for someone who spent months outrunning their own emotions. Because now the avoidant starts revisiting moments they once minimized. Conversations they dismissed suddenly feel meaningful. Your patience becomes more visible in hindsight. Your emotional consistency becomes harder to replace. They begin replaying your absence mentally, not because they plan to, but because the mind naturally returns to unresolved emotional experiences. The silence becomes psychologically loud. And perhaps the hardest realization for an avoidant is recognizing that the person they withdrew from did not collapse without them. You continued living, growing, healing, evolving. Your emotional stability becomes undeniable evidence that life moved forward even without their participation. That realization creates internal tension because it removes the illusion of endless time. For a long time, many avoidants unconsciously believe they can reconnect later, after they sort themselves out, after they feel less overwhelmed, after life becomes easier emotionally. But growth changes the timeline. Your detachment changes the timeline. Now the possibility emerges that the connection may no longer be waiting for them when they finally feel ready. And that possibility creates urgency. Not always dramatic urgency. Avoidants rarely become emotionally explosive overnight. More often, the pressure builds quietly beneath the surface. Curiosity increases. Emotional memories intensify. Regret grows stronger. They begin wondering if silence protected them or cost them something meaningful. This is when many avoidants finally reach out. Not because someone manipulated them, not because pressure forced them, but because emotional suppression became heavier than vulnerability itself. Reaching out becomes less frightening than permanently losing the connection. And this is important to understand. When an avoidant breaks silence, it is often the result of an internal battle nobody else could see. Pride had to weaken. Emotional defenses had to crack. The fear of vulnerability had to become smaller than the fear of regret. That is why chasing rarely works. Pressure strengthens defenses. But emotional absence creates space for self-confrontation. Your calmness allows reality to become visible without interference. And whether they reach out or not, there is a deeper lesson here that matters even more than reconciliation. Your job was never to force someone into emotional readiness. Your job was to remain connected to yourself while loving another human being, to maintain your dignity even in uncertainty, to refuse to abandon your emotional health trying to rescue someone from their own avoidance. Because real power is not controlling whether someone returns. Real power is becoming emotionally whole, regardless of who stays, who leaves, or who finally realizes your value too late. And sometimes the silence they use to escape emotions becomes the very thing that forces them to finally face them.